and that's and another factor here is that the diesel that the facility has to use is ultra low sulfur diesel, which is a very clean diesel fuel. In fact, in some respects, from a sulfur perspective, as clean as natural gas.
Yep.
One of the things that I'm just I'm reviewing what you responded, I believe, to Woodard Curran's criticism of your, this is the response here, is that right? November 10th, 11th.
Yep.
And you stated in here, in answer to some of the questions that were answered, AMEC evaluated the potential for fugitive PM emissions from the metal spreader. This doesn't address the engine
Right.
issues, and concluded that the PM's fractions would be sufficiently large and the unit sufficiently controlled with water injection spray and a shroud such that offsets impacts would be minimal and would meet the town's ordinance standards. Therefore, these fugitive emissions were not included in the impacts.
That's correct.
Because you simply felt they were too large to, for lack of a better word, go airborne.
I
Is
think
that
that's
it?
fair, yes, absolutely.
Okay, and this is the response that you did to the current criticism of your study.
Correct.
We'll move over to sound. We asked for a live test back in spring. We were told that the DEP would never approve running that diesel prior to issuing the permit, et cetera, et cetera. So about 8 months ago, we would have been at the same place with the live sound test as we are now. But that aside, the day of the testing, I don't remember what the weather was like that day, but question for one of the sound engineers, if it had been a strong breezy day, how much impact does that have on the transmission of sound across the property line into the residential areas?
Well, certainly, the meteorological conditions do play somewhat of a role in propagation of sound. The day of the testing on November 1st, the winds were relatively light. But they were blowing in a direction from the shredder generally to the east, towards the eastern property line. On a very windy day, perhaps, what you're going to get more is the sound of the wind itself. This was actually a pretty decent day to do the testing because the sound we were getting, in general, we felt was reasonably coming from the facility itself, with a few exceptions, as we noted in the report.
Okay. Another question. Looking at your data of the live test, the values are running roughly, say, between the mid-50s to just about 60 decibels. Is there any margin error or standard deviation? I mean, you've put like hard numbers there, and it's, you know, say we got a value of 59. Is that 59 plus or minus 5 decibels, or is it there's no standard deviation in your live testing data or your analysis of that?
Well, I mean, there's no, this is not modeling where you might have a standard deviation go into it. This is actual measured, and the precision of these instruments is very tight. I guess what I might suggest is that's one of the reasons we did an hour's worth of testing, so that Berwick iron and metal just constantly fed, you know, nonstop, a steady stream of vehicles and other scrap metal through the shredder. And as you can see from the chart, the plot, if you will, on the chart, there is a little variation. It's not surprising. It goes up and down by several decibels. So frankly, it's not a huge deviation. It's a fairly, not quite steady, but almost steady sort of sound, varying by several decibels. So I wouldn't, and I would say over the course of that hour, that was again, the purpose was to get a variety of material through that. So that variety of material actually shows up in some of the slight variation you see in there.
Okay, that's the last question I have for you, but I have one more question, just, actually, this is probably Jim can answer this from the code enforcement officer. In Tech Environments report on page 3, there's a little statement here about the Maine DEP noise regulations, chapter 400, section 4F2, sets daytime average hour sound limits, 1 hour equal blah, blah, blah. And it has 75 at the boundary for facility property and 60 dBA at a protected location. The department defines a protected location as any location with a parcel of land that contains a residence. This state law to me sounds as though it, or the state standard, seems to me suggests that the sound at any residential property could not be more than 60 dBA. Does that take precedent over our ordinance?
I would say no. You set your ordinance at 75 decibels in that particular zone, not 60. So that's what I have to go by, is the ordinance. Excuse me, and in interpreting the ordinance, I say that that whole piece of property has to be less than 75 decibels.
Right, I can understand that.
And I understand what you're saying, and I don't believe that would be, I imagine, a question to the town attorney, that that overruled.
That's, I wonder if Alan could comment. but-
Well, the only thing that they have complied with is what our town is
Okay,
requiring.
that's
If
what
they
I
needed to get a state permit, then it would be a different standard. And there probably are a variety of different standards in towns and different states and stuff like that. And all we can go by is what
In our ordinance, okay, that's what I was curious about. I didn't know if the state language superseded any language that we had to apply. And I think the question of whether it's 60 or 75 dB is a discussion that's open. I agree, in the zone, 75 is what's allowed. But anything that migrates across the property line, in a residential zone, we'll only allow 60, so to be in
Is that in the ordinance? Can you tell me where that's in the ordinance?
I don't see where in the ordinance it says
No,
that
I
it
don't
doesn't
either.
apply.
And that's why I'm staying, I stuck with the 75 decibels.
I just have it's my understanding that that is in the ordinance specifically states at the boundary.
At the boundary, right.
And who's here telling us where those sounds were placed? At the boundary? Where is it? At the boundary?
Yes, the sound levels are measured at the property boundaries in conformance with the Berwick ordinance.
And Jim,
Or if you go into across the boundary, then you're not going according to the ordinance. It says at the boundary, and that boundary is in the commercial industrial zone. At 75 decibels.
I'm no expert on this, and we have, we, as you see, have a multitude of people up here to go through. But I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Sami, I'm here. Anything further than where you took, you would assume that would be less, would you not?
Correct. As you go further
Right.
away from the boundary, the sound level should continue to
Which is
decrease.
probably why in the ordinance says it specifically states at the boundary. Now, Jim, when you would be the enforcement of this, unless and if a DPP permit is granted or whatever, you would be the enforcer of this. And you would be enforcing the 75 decibel limit, is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
I've just been thinking about, I mean, I partially read it, and I listened to Julie, and it gets
common sense
That's why
is
we
gonna
have it at
tell
the
you
property.
that, that's why you have it as a property. That's my point is that just common sense would tell you that that's, chances are that's what would happen. You know, just so we're on the same page. We have quite a long, thing here, that specifically states that they, and use us graphs and everything, that they met everything under the 75, but did not meet under the 60. But if we're basing this on 75, then under the 60 doesn't apply.
If I could just
Or over
clarify,
the 60 doesn't.
if I could just clarify, the report does establish that we meet the 60 as well. There are a few instantaneous instances where it might go above 60, but that's not how the way the ordinance requires the measurement, even if it were 60. So our position, and Rod could address this further if you wanted to, but the position of the board is not only do we meet the 75, which is the ordinance standard, but in any case, we also meet the 60,
Except for specific times.
except for on an instantaneous basis, a single instantaneous basis.
So at this time, I'm gonna open it up to the public. Once again, I would just ask to direct your questions to the chair. We'll get the specific person, to answer for you if we can. And please, when you stand up, please just state your name. Won't have anybody go to the podium. Obviously, it's too crowded in here, and me and empty chairs. So just stand where you are, and please just state your name and your address so that we have it for the minute report, for our knowledge. And with that, Attorney Murphy, did you want to start?
Well,
First, can I ask you, who are your clients that you're representing, and are they all here tonight?
Doug and Jeanette Sibright
Mhm.
are snowbirds. They're in Florida tonight. They send hello. I believe they sent a letter. Juliette Lapierre lives on Route 236. She's here tonight. Mr. Planch, Tom Planch, lives down the street from the plant on Route 236. He's here tonight. Robert and Donna Duffy, my other clients, they live next door. The abutters you've heard about, they're here tonight. And Ray and Joyce Preventure, also two of my clients, they're here tonight as well. Not sure if Mr. Perro is here, Taylor Perro from Powerhouse Lane, Powerhouse Road, he's also one of my clients. He works second shift at Plant New Hampshire, so I don't believe he could be here tonight.
Thank you.
I don't want to, I would like the citizens to speak first, but if I could, I have a procedural question for the chair. We seem to be talking right now about air quality standards and about noise standards. We have some expert testimony that we'd like to add, and so we're wondering if we could at least finish those two topics before we move on to the more general, but it's your,
That's fine with me. Who would you like to have speak?
why don't we start there?
Okay.
Because that's fresh. And I'm gonna let, this is Attorney Jeff Calvert from the Portland law firm of Frederick Larry. He's an environmental law expert, so I'm gonna ask him to speak in his place.
With me here tonight, we have two experts as well. Glenn Almquist from Woodard and Curran. He's the individual that wrote what you were hearing, the Woodard and Curran critique of the AMEC report on air. I'm also here with a gentleman from Tech Environmental who did the noise assessment alongside Epsilon. And I'm going to just give a brief overview so that people understand sort of the context under which you'll hear testimony from our experts. But I think there are fundamental legal disagreements that we have with the way that Berwick Iron and Metal is evaluating both air and noise. First off, just on the air emissions, we disagree that the National Ambient Air Quality Standards are the way to look at air emissions in Berwick. First off, we think that the Berwick standard is clearly more broad than the state and the federal standards. If you take a look at the Berwick ordinance provision, it lists the basic concerns that should be addressed, and then there's a sentence at the very end saying, any air emissions must meet all applicable state and federal statutes. So if all you had to do was meet the state and federal statutes, it would just say that. It would be done in one line, but it says emission of dust, dirt, fly ash, fumes, vapors, gases which could be injurious to humans, animals or vegetation, detrimental to the enjoyment or adjoining or neighboring properties, or could soil, stain persons or property at any point beyond the property line of the commercial or industrial establishment creating that emission shall not be permitted. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards that were referenced earlier only address 6 pollutants, 6 criteria pollutants. So you were absolutely right when you asked the question about mercury, lead, other pollutants potentially are not addressed by the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. The other thing is when you do a National Ambient Air Quality Standard analysis, typically you look at stationary sources. The question that was also asked about mobile sources and emissions from diesel usage on those sources is also right on, because that's something that is also, we would argue, in the Berwick standard, something that should have been examined. So primarily we're saying that not enough pollutants were looked at. For example, when you shred a car and you put forth, there's seat cushions, there's all kinds of stuff potentially in cars. We're going to get particulate matter that's potentially larger than PM10 that's addressed by the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which were not examined. In addition to that, we think that all of the sources at the facility were not looked at. They primarily just focus on the shredder. And Mr. Almquist will talk a little bit more about this, but there are actually studies and reports industry-wide about how you identify the various sources of emissions at a facility like this. And there are actually emissions factors that you would apply for those various sources. Those were also not looked at. So with that, the other thing that was in the report was, well, we did a visual inspection. And we were out there when the shredder was operating, and we could visually see that there weren't emissions that concerned us. I mean, we also disagree with that because of the fact that some of these pollutants are simply not visible. Nitrogen oxide, it's not something you can look at. Opacity, yeah, maybe a way, a surrogate to look for particulate matter, but for some of these other pollutants, we don't think that a visual inspection suffices. With that, I'll have Glenn maybe address some of our specific concerns.
You stole my thunder. Thank you, everyone. And I think Tim did a nice job of reviewing the process, and I think that the work that AMEC did relative to the diesel engine itself was fine quality work. The issue I had, and what I explained in the report that I put together, was that typically when you're looking at, or you're doing a permit application, and you're looking at a facility from a town standard or from a regulatory engineer, like a DEP standard, first thing you do is do an emissions inventory. You look to see what are the sources on the site, which of these sources can generate emissions, and then what are the emission levels for those. I concur. I think that the emissions from the shredder itself are probably minimal. And as Jeff just said, there are published emission factors that experts like AMEC and Tim use when they prepare these applications. So had that been done, or had they consulted some of the other information from other similar facilities, they would see that in fact there's a whole host of items, some of which I referred to in my report, that do get quantified and do get analyzed when you put together an application for a permit to DEP. I think the difference here is that your standards are different than the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. I think it's important that they meet those, and I would say that had a number of these other sources been included, the impacts that Tim referred to as being below the standards, that margin he talked about, that some of that margin would be either way. Would it go over the standard? I can't tell you because we didn't do the analysis. But had you included those other, all those emission sources, you would have had higher impacts than what was represented by only.
So you didn't do that type of analysis either?
You did not do that analysis.
Was there a reason for that? Why you didn't do that?
Just wasn't required, wasn't asked.
Do you have anything in particular that you could point to that would potentially, under any circumstances, rise it above the national standards?
The operations could now. And the point is, when Tim referred to the fact that you don't necessarily include mobile sources, and he's correct. There are a lot of sources on that move around this site that you wouldn't necessarily include in a permit to the DEP, because it's not the type of equipment they look at. However, from a town perspective, these are still emissions that are generated on the site. They're still emissions that will affect people in the community. So relative to your standard, from my perspective, there are things that should have been looked at relative to satisfying the town ordinance. Not necessarily that you could still use the nationally mandated quality standards as a guide, but there are certain emissions that come out. Even the AMEC report said some of the emissions out of the shredder are too large. Well, they're right, they're too large because the federal standard deals with very fine particulate. But, a perfect example, if you have a cat or a dog in your house, the fur that rolls around the floor you sweep up every day, that's a bit of a nuisance, right? That's why you sweep it up and get it out of your house. Material like that could come out of a facility like this, wouldn't be regulated under national ambient air quality standards, but I would suggest that under your ordinance, it would be something that you would.
Well, what evidence would there be that it would be injurious? I mean, that cat hair that's being swept up, you're talking about it getting further into the air and affecting abutting properties, that's what the standard.
I'm using that as an example.
Okay, but use anything that's in that plan to give us a scenario whereby any of that stuff would be emulsified, it would end up being airborne. That could
Absolutely.
potentially, because that's what we have to look at.
For example, one combustion source, the diesel engine, which is, as you heard, is a very old engine, and to your question, engines do vary in their emissions. It's not the same emission per gallon of fuel. It depends on the performance of the engine. Your car is a good example. Why do you get tuned up? So that it runs better. Same with older engines versus newer engines. Newer engines are better designed, they have fewer pollutants per liter. So, yeah, EPA does publish emission factors. If you look at them, they have different factors for different size engines, different age engines. So I do take a bit of an exception to that statement. Getting back to your question, because you have all these, you have lots of diesel equipment running around the site. You also have diesel vehicles that are coming on and off the site. While they're on the property, they are emitting the same kinds of pollutants that you'd see coming from the diesel engine that runs the shredder. Those emissions will drift off the site, just like they would, just like the emissions from the engine.
But are you suggesting that if there's a certain amount of trucks, we'll get to the point where that kind of emission is going to put over the
Possible.
federal standard? Well,
It's possible, yes,
possible?
yes.
How many trucks would it have to be?
You can do that analysis, but it's the burden of the applicant to do that sort of analysis. If I was preparing an application or done a report similar to the one that was submitted to you, I would have at least identified this. I wouldn't just dismiss them saying, take my word for it, emissions of this source are so low, we don't have to look at it.
So
That's
you would
essentially
run
what
a
they,
different investigation than what the standard that they ran. Are
I-
there different tests,
It's not
criteria that
tests,
you
it's-
can run,
it's-
or different reports that you can run? It just seems like you guys are on totally different
well, if you look at
walks of life.
what happens today, other facilities that are being permitted, and it's a new facility, other new facilities throughout the country, there aren't all that many shredders in the country. And there are some new ones. The new ones, many of them have to go through the detailed analysis of emissions from many sources. Cutting with a torch generates emissions. So any one of these, I think by themselves are relatively small, I wouldn't disagree with that. But when you look at the cumulative effect of all of those, it does have, it can be problematic. I don't know why they didn't do it, I don't know why they
Well,
didn't do
probably
it.
the emissions from the trucks, those are already going in and out of the site as we speak.
But
And
they also have, they do have equipment that's stationary. It acts as a stationary sorting site. So they have a crane that's picking up cars and putting it into the shredder. That sits there all day. It's a diesel-driven piece of equipment, emitting the same pollutants that are coming out of the shredder. Those weren't considered. And it would be reasonable to include something like that that sits in one place and acts as a stationary sorter.
Chair Ashburn, if I may, this is why you hired a peer reviewer, and
well, that's what I was gonna turn it over to
and
him.
Mr. Almquist's clients agreed with that, and we've heard from the peer reviewer, and the peer reviewer says this is an appropriate study, and he believes that frankly it's appropriate. Now we're hearing again from Mr. Murphy's clients that it wasn't good enough, but it seems to me that's why we agreed to, and you
Thank
asked
you,
for a peer
Attorney
review.
Long, but you guys should there get
Well, I know, but it's
And I get it, I get what you're saying, and I'm gonna turn it right over to our peer analysis guy, right out Tim. I didn't mean to downgrade you by calling you just a guy where you are hiding in the back. But I just wanna get down there, I'm just trying to get as much knowledge, both sides, as I can. And that's all I'm doing, and then I'm gonna turn it over to the person we hired to to clarify all this for us.
I'd be happy.
And also, as a point of order, they have an opportunity to say whatever they want to say.
Right.
So we can have a person that can say they're wrong, they still have a right in front of hearing to say whatever they want to say, they can disagree with our peer review, and that's not the answer to peer review. You have to weigh all the evidence, they can come up and present whatever they want, this is their opportunity to address the board and argue whatever they want. So it's certainly appropriate for any of these experts to come up and take exception with what the peer reviewer may say, or exception to anything that they may say. So I think the board's job now is ready to do, is to listen to that.
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
That's quite all right. So, I mean, I think I'd be happy to provide you with copies of other permits that have been issued in other states for shredders that do identify many of these.
I have a question on how, because I'm trying to think about how this would be done had we would have added the acetylene switches, for example, the forklift driving back and forth. And to me, it's there's a lot of little individual ones, like there isn't any site of this type. And I think from what Tim Donnelly said, individually, they probably are below the significant impact level individually. You're saying if you would sum them up, add them all up,
Let's put them all together.
put them all together, maybe it would have, be above that impact level.
Maybe.
Is that what
Correct,
you're saying?
and Tim referred to an interactive sources. Sometimes you have to look out and find other sources that you have to include your emissions from, to use the power plant as an example. That wasn't done. I agree, I don't think, if I were doing it, I wouldn't have bothered with that either. But I would have looked at the other sources on the site, because they can have the same type
And
of.
sum them up. Do you, and I know this is problematic, if you can't answer, but do you have an opinion as to whether the state DEP, when they reviewed the permit, they considered these other individuals?
There are some sources there, I don't think that he did, because it wasn't presented. Now, I don't know, as you say, there aren't many of these around. I don't know if there's another one in the state of Maine. So it's not like they have a lot of experience with these types of sources. There are other points on the facility that would be included, and I can show you some other permits there where they are included. Conveyors, they're stationary sources. Conveyors are not covered here, and I agree the material on the conveyors are wet. So you're not gonna get a lot of material blowing off those, but you could have some. When the material falls off the conveyor, both the automobile shredder or the fluff and the steel, the material that's been separated, there's dust generated from that. When that material is loaded with a front-end loader, which has another diesel source, and dumped into a vehicle, you have another point where you have emissions generated. Those are all sources that individually, again, I don't think any one of them is all that significant. But if you look at those cumulatively, it could very well be, and that wasn't done. And the inventory wasn't done. The other point relative to your question is that some of these sources, mobile sources, for example, the DEP does not. No state includes those in a facility permit. So I would agree, including those in a permit application in the state wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. To satisfy your standard, I think they would be appropriate. to take a look at. And I have a whole bunch of other comments based on some of the things that I've said today, but I don't know if you want to.
It's your time.
Maybe we'll just go through quickly. The comment on the reduced load, Tim asked whether or not he looked at reduced load on the engine, so it operates at a lower load, the emissions higher. That really, my comment wasn't directed to that. The way a shredder operates is you're throwing equipment, you're throwing metal in it. And when it hits a hard piece of metal, the engine bogs a little bit. And they have some equipment to help it run better. But a good analogy would be if you see a truck driving down the road, a diesel-driven truck, and it comes to a hill, they step on the gas, you see the smoke come out of the stack. The same kind of thing happens with a shredder. When it hits some heavy material, it bogs down a little bit, and you get that engine straining, and you do have higher emissions. That sort of analysis of what those emissions might be and what the effect might be was not included. He talked about the fact that the modeling was done based on 87 CPRs versus ZIP at 100 full-time year-round. And that's a pretty standard procedure. It's a conservative way to look at it. When you're looking at short-term standards, he talked about 1 hour ambient air quality standards. It doesn't make any difference whether you run it at 87, that's just the way the model works. If you're looking at a long-term, like an annual standard, then it's important. If you're looking at a 1 hour standard, it's not important. It doesn't make any difference. It's not considered from that perspective.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
What would you look at, and it seems to be an interesting point that you're making about it being bogged would you get that information? How
Go to
would
the
you
engine,
capture
I would go to the engine manufacturer, because it's such an old engine, it might be hard to get that, I'll acknowledge that. I'm a bit surprised that it was. Yeah, you could test it, right, you could run this test.
How practical is that, to test it while it's running?
Well, that's how most emissions tests are done by facilities in the home. Stack test, you're not testing the engineer, you're doing what's called a stack test. Tim mentioned the fact that the SO2 and CO emissions were below, impacts were below the significance level. They were below. Again, if you included these other sources, that might not be the case. He also talked about the fact that ultra-low diesel fuel is being used in the locomotive engine that drives the shredder. I don't know if that's true for all the other equipment on the site. It may be. If it's not, then you're gonna have much higher emissions from some of those compounds from all the other diesel equipment than you would have for natural. And I didn't see whether that's facility-wide at all. It may be. That was generally it. I think if you want to ask questions, Ed, probably some of the, I don't know, like quickly, Tim did a good job of talking about the model and how that works. It would have been interesting to see where that maximum impact has occurred. Normally that's included in a report. I didn't see it in this particular one.
So you don't really take any exception to the way, the modeling approach, because that's what your firm is doing, so.
Yeah, it's a standard procedure that Tim's firm, AMEC, our firm, any firm that does air-dispersed modeling would use that same model. Again, I didn't see, there was no discussion, I didn't see the input files, I didn't see the output files. Normally those would be included. I suspect it wouldn't have meant anything to any of you, so you didn't include them.
Well, what would it have meant to you as looking at it, and what would it have meant to them?
Well, it would have allowed both of us to get an idea for what assumptions we used in the model. And to verify, when they talk about, they present information on emissions from the engine, it would allow you to verify that in fact that was done correctly and check the math, which is often done when you do a peer review.
In your firm's experience, how often have you done modeling, including all these secondary sources? You've taken an inventory, maybe included the torch, you included the truck coming through again.
Now, I can tell you, we have facilities where we do all of that. But it does depend, again, what I said, if I was applying for a permit application to the state, a lot of the things I mentioned, I wouldn't include because the state doesn't require you to do a comparison with the national and the air quality standards. You, on the other hand, are looking at it from a different perspective. You're looking at it from based on your ordinance, what's happening with the community and the facilities around the site. So road dust that gets picked up, that's something you can quantify. The emission factors, trucks go in and out, you can calculate it, 10 times
How
a
would
year.
we ever determine whether it be injurious to a neighbor?
Well,
Don't we still have to go to some standard?
You could use that same standard.
Will we have to look at some kind of national standard? You could just arbitrarily say, it just seems like there's a bunch of dust, or it just seems like there's a lot of diesel, and, this is figuring, that we're going to take a leap in size, that could be injurious.
No, I don't disagree that, that approach that they use comparing the national and the air quality standard, I probably would have done the same thing, because there's not a lot of information out there to judge, good, bad. There are other techniques that can be used, and I'm sure IMEC is probably familiar with some of those, they're good friends. And so again, this is a little bit different type of analysis, where you're looking at a facility effect on the local community. You're not looking at an engine effect on national and air quality. It's a little more than that.
And Alan, just to address that, I know you keep using the word injurious, I do want to just remind you that the Berwick ordinance also says enjoyment of adjoining property. So it's not just injury, which I agree with you, there may not be a quantitative way to assess whether or not.
No one's going to enjoy having this in the house.
Right.
So it has to be something a little bit more substantial than a pure enjoyment.
Well, then it would be
something detrimental, it has to take away from your enjoyment. So there has to be something injurious, or something that's going to take away from your enjoyment. So there's gotta be some way to quantify that.
It's presented in the ordinance though, does it? Doesn't the ordinance just say enjoyment? I think that's why the people are here. We're concerned about what it does in the town. And all the evidence we've seen today is presenting against standards that some high-minded people with lots of calculators and more information than we can understand, they set those standards, and I get as a legal thing, that's the deal. But in Berwick, our deal is enjoyment of the property. And I agree, if they change the ordinance and we have to have a measurement for it, so be it. But right now, it seems like hands up who thinks they're gonna enjoy it.
Yeah, and you know, Alan, I mean, in a lot of legal standards too, when there is a standard that's quantitative, it ends up being reasonable, which is why, again, like you're saying, people are here and people's input matters. Is it reasonable? I think
An approach would be to take all of those sources and use the same model. And see what model relative to those things. That would be a very,
We would still have to see if it exceeds the standard.
you could use that, you could compare it to the national and
Let me get back to my first. Couple seats up there. Where these tests came out and what may be the national standard. What is the likelihood that that would ever be done by these, rather small incidental things that you're bringing up? You're still affected them. I mean, are you really here to advocate, do you really feel there's some liability that that's actually going to exceed the standard?
I would,
All you're saying is it could.
I wouldn't be surprised either, quite honest with you. There is, you know, they're not that far away from two of them. The NOx standard and one of the PM standards. The short-term NOx and the annual PM. I mean, it's not all that complicated to do the analysis. Unless you have any other questions.
We'll save that for, a couple of things while you guys have your chance to make your presentation.
There is actually, and listening to this, I just read about a case, and it was in California, in Simi Valley, California, and it was a shredder operation there, and they had to meet all of the national ambient air quality testing. And what happened was, once they opened up and they started to work, they found that these people did not meet these standards, and they were actually fined over $3 million, and they had to comply and had to put in new machinery that would keep those emissions, those air quality emissions down. So there is a lot of value in what this gentleman has to say, because it has happened. When you look at those values, and they haven't all been measured, and that's what happened with this facility out in Simi Valley, California, Orange County. So I have a few more things, but I just wanted to address that issue.
With that, now, I'll turn it over to Peter Goldberg, who measures sound.
So good evening, Madam Chair and members of the planning board. My name is Peter Goldberg. I'm president of Tech Environmental in Waltham, Massachusetts. I've been a consultant with over 20 years of experience.
We can't hear you, Peter.
hear you. I'm an acoustic consultant. And that's 70 decibels,
Good, we like
and
it.
that's 80 decibels.
Try 90. You're just in violation.
I already knew that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm also currently working for Maine DEP as an acoustic consultant, as their primary reviewer for the Windhoven projects in the state, and that's equally contentious as insurance. I was asked by Freddie Flaherty for their clients to take measurements at the same locations that Mr. O'Neill did on November 1st, and we did that at 2 locations. You have my report. I just want to focus on the measurements on the Duffy property. I want to speak to the interpretation of the sound ordinance. And actually, before I do that, those are the 2 things I want to.
Can you show us where the Duffy property
Yeah.
is so we know?
Sure, sure, the Duffy property, the infamous Duffy property. Okay, so north is up, and 236 is here, and there's the entrance to Plant Powerhouse Road, the transfer station, and this home right here is the home of Robert and Donald Duffy, who are sitting back there in the back row, and this is the property line. You can see it's just beyond the west side of their house. So one of the sound measurement locations that both Epsilon and our firm set up was close to this property line, just beyond the house there. It may be a minor point, but we were a few feet inside the property. And I'm sure the board knows that the Duffy's property resides in the R2 residential district. So the measurements were made in the residential district on the Duffy property, the ones I'm going to be talking about. So is everyone familiar where the Duffy property is?
Is that on Powerhouse Boulevard?
No, Powerhouse Road's over here.
Oh. It's up behind the dump. Oh.
From the top of the hill.
Good script. In his introductory remarks, Mr. Harmon mentioned that some equipment had been added to the conveyors. It wasn't on the original plans that had been filed with the board in March. And I just realized that from some observations that were made during the sidewalk on November 5th, that Mr. Almquist noticed that there was a vibratory screen that had been brought onto the site, but was not yet installed. The board may want to inquire as to whether that vibratory screen, which would be on the back end of the process, after the shredded metal comes out, it goes through a large screen. It's a big metal box, and it has a motor, and it makes a real racket. It's one of the loudest things that you hear at a stone and rock crushing plant. I'm not sure that vibratory screen was running on November 1st during the sound test. So you might want to inquire as to whether it was.
Was it?
We don't have a vibratory screen, that's incorrect. We do not own one.
I think the piece of equipment that he was looking at is not a vibratory screen. It's a magnetic separator. Okay, thank you for clearing that up. The measurements that we made were made at several locations and at several times. The main DEP limit is based on an average sound level. And Mr. O'Neill also presented average sound levels in his report that you've seen. The Berwick Town ordinance is distinctly different in that it sets, quote, the maximum permissible sound threshold. It doesn't speak to average sound levels. And the ordinance also refers to what's called a slow response measurement. That's a term that, again, refers to maximum sound level measurements. In acoustics, we refer to L with an MAX after it, L with max. So what I have here on this first chart are the maximum sound level measurements made with a slow response, and that's the red trace here. And the blue trace is the fast response maximum sound level measurements made during the 1-hour test of the shredder just inside the Duffy property line. And for reference, the green line is at 60 decibels.
How far inside the Duffy property line were you?
Just a few feet.
Less than 10.
Probably not more than 10. And it wasn't me, it was my engineer. I was over on the side. Now, from looking at the wording in your ordinance, it's clear to me that the maximum limit of 60 decibels for a residential district applies to the Duffy residential property, being as they are in the residential district. Mr. O'Neill has argued just the opposite. He has said that the Berwick ordinance's residential sound limits do not apply to the street because the ordinance applies depending upon where the source is located, not based on the receptor. Now, that interpretation is counter to common sense. And the manner in which these types of noise ordinances are generally applied. I've seen many noise ordinances, municipal and state, in the over 30 years that I've been working in acoustics. I've never seen any ordinance applied in the manner in which Mr. O'Neill is saying your ordinance should be applied. Because in essence, Epsilon is arguing that the lower 60 decibel limit that's written into your ordinance for residential districts cannot be applied to protect residents who live next to an industrial noise source. Well, what's the point of having them there? I've never seen an ordinance applied in the manner in which Epsilon is suggesting. Now, the Berwick ordinance is similar to many municipal ordinances that were brought in and written in the last 20 to 25 years. For example, the town of York passed a noise ordinance in their town meeting back in 1985 that's very similar to your ordinance. It sets maximum limits based on land use. It clearly states that the residential limit for sound from any source as received into that district is regulated by the number for that district, and explicitly states that if sound is coming from an industrial district to a residential district, that obviously the number for the residential district applies. That's what it's there for. The 60 is there to protect the residents, not to protect the industrial source. So York also set a daytime limit of 55. Now, I just want to walk through some of these measurements. You'll see that the slow response, Lmax, sound level measurements that we measured, which is the red trace here, which is what I believe your ordinance requires for a measurement, was slightly below 60, but in the last 2 minutes of the measurement that we took, we did get an exceedance above 60. Now, my engineer noticed that towards the end of the 60-minute test that the sound from the shredder was actually increasing. And you'll note that in the field notes that are at the rear of our report, the notes for every minute about the sound that he was hearing. And as the sound was increasing towards the end of the 60th minute, Epsilon shut off their meter exactly at the 60th minute. But my engineer chose, because of the increasing sound and the metal clanging and banging and the metal sliding noise, to leave the sound meter on for 2 more minutes. So that's why we measured these peaks here, and Epsilon doesn't report those because they had turned off their meter. Now, if we extrapolate these measurements out for an entire workday, in other words, one exceedance, I believe this red point, one exceedance in an hour, but if the shredder's not running for an hour, it's running for an 8-hour workday, you come up with 8 exceedances in a day. That is a violation of your ordinance. The other chart I have here is also found in the report. And this is just a comparison of the fast response sound level measurements that our firm made, which is the blue trace here, with the fast response measurements at Epsilon. And they generally track each other. You'll note that theirs ended here, and we took measurements and recorded for 2 more minutes, which is why ours rises up here. Now, if the town's ordinance was enforced using what we call a fast response measurement, which is what the DEP does use in their regulations for maximum sound level, then there would have been many more exceedances than just the one that I reported under the slow response measurements. So, just to summarize, our measurements on November 1st, I think, revealed that the maximum sound levels are very close to 60 decibels. We did measure one exceedance in 1 hour period. In my report, I have a recommendation that if this board chooses to issue a permit to Berwick Iron and Metal Recycling, that they consider additional testing. One, either continuous sound level testing on the Duffy property or some independent sound level measurements during metal shredding operations to confirm that the operation is in continuous compliance. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
While we're here, can I respond to one thing, clear up one thing on this? Is that spike you have at the end of the test, what happens with that machinery is that machinery has to be shut down at the end of the day. And when you shut the machine down, you've had a load of metal coming through. When you shut it down, you have to clear the machine, you have to get all that metal out of there. Prior to doing that, as it's being loaded, that is acting as a sound barrier for everything coming out of the machine. So when you empty the machine, then that chute is wide open, and you're gonna have a higher noise level. It's true, I don't disbelieve you, we were higher at that point. That is within your ordinance. We ran this test for 1 day, and in actual operations, you will only clean that machine out once a day. Your ordinance allows a 15-minute interval where you exceed that 60 decibels. And so that is an exception when it's coming up. It's not gonna happen 8 times a day, because you're only gonna clear that machine at the end of the day, so you can go in there and do maintenance and shred. You can't leave the material in there, okay, to go in and do your maintenance. You can shut the machine down, leave the material in there during the day. If you have a malfunction, something like that, you can shut it down. But when you have to go inside it and do maintenance, you have to get all the metal out of it. And when you're doing that, you've taken away a sound barrier. And that's what happened that last winter.
So every day at the end of the day, that will happen.
Absolutely. Unless, unless there's some further buffering on it.
And there is a provision in the ordinance that specifically allows that.
And will you confirm again that there is no vibrating screen there?
I have to go back to Bob, but my belief is that piece of equipment is not a vibrating screen.
What's that? No, it's not, we do not have a vibrating screen whatsoever. We do not own a vibrating screen.
What piece of equipment are they referring to then?
They're referring to it's called an SGM. It's a sorter. Basically, it takes metal away from plastic, what it does. It has a
By
pan.
not shaking
It
it.
has a pan feeder on it, but we do not have a vibrating screen. They're two different things.
So how does it separate?
It separates it by,
Magnets, essentially.
yeah, it's what they call a rare earth magnet. They're little tiny magnets that push together and they make a field, and it goes over a conveyor, and then it like throws it up in the air. It's the best way I can explain it.
Inside the,
Yeah, it actually goes on top of a conveyor, and it's got like a head pulley, and then it just flings it off. How noisy will that be when it's running compared to? It's not noisy at all. I mean, it's gonna generate a little more noise, absolutely. But it's not a loud machine. It's not going to generate a lot of noise. And if we need to add a little bit of extra, noise panels or whatever to make up for that, it's not a big deal.
so that's not up and running.
That
Was that running that day?
No, it was
It's
not.
not connected.
Anybody from the board have any questions?
Thank you.
Question, I have a question. Question, Mike Macklin, Roy. Sure. When the,
Hold on 1 minute for the public. Are you all set with your people giving their presentations? I just wanna do, you know, the sides and then we'll open it up to the public.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so now we will, I'm sorry, I shut you off in the back. I'll let you speak first, actually, if you wanna stand up. Just give your name and your address,
Mike
please.
Macklin, 5 Shelby Lane,
Okay.
Berwick. I just have a question, when the sound tests were done, was there a lot of vegetation, i.e., leaves and stuff in the trees? And if so, would you expect the sound level to be a little bit higher in the dead of winter?
Okay, both sound experts would stand and respond to that, that'd be great. And I pick you.
I don't think that the sound levels would be pushed.
How was the vegetation? That was one of the questions. Was it sparse or bulk?
There were still
I'm
leaves
thinking
on
we
the
had
tree.
that hurricane, so they're probably pretty sparse at that.
It had already snowed too, remember? So most of the leaves, there were a few leaves left, most of them were down. I agree with Mr. Moonberg, it would not make any appreciable difference.
So the question, you don't think it would go up, the levels would increase that much at that, at any of the property lines that you took?
Correct.
I both concur. Sir?
Donald Young, 4 Bridge Street, Berwick. The question was asked if it would make a difference in the sound because of the leaves, and that they might absorb some of the sound. But sound travels better in warmer air. So the question should be, what would be the sound variation in appreciable density or noise level in the summer? What if this test were done in August? Now we'd ask the same 2 sound experts to refer to that.
Possibly would be lower.
Lower in the summer.
Yes, because the morning we were out there, we had what was probably very stable air, it was calm air. It was a fair representation of, I would say, the worst case weather conditions. And once you go into the summer season, you get a lot of mixing in the air. There's a lot of convective activity because the ground is being heated by the sun. We don't have much sun. So you have wind, you have vertical mixing, all of that tends to diminish sound. And also, as Mr. O'Meara mentioned, you have the sound of the wind interference. So a calm morning on November 1st was probably the best situation in terms of worst case conditions.
I would agree. In addition, in the summertime, the humidity is going to be higher than it was in November. That would add a slight bit of additional absorption between the source and the property line. Not a lot, because the distances we're talking about are not tremendous, but slightly downward rather than upward.
Sir?
Bob Duffy, 128 Route 236. The week of the test, when they fired up the shredder, I know Rob said he had to tweak it up. The first day they started it, we knew it sounded like a jet plane. It did subside quite a bit. And we did get diesel smell from the smokestack that day also. And other times we have motor oil, I call it motor oil or gear oil smell. It's like a mist in the air. It's horrible. We have to go inside the house. That was the summer.
So you must like the smell of that sewer plant.
Debbie Rendell, Powerhouse Road. Mr. Harmon, the last house on Powerhouse Road, is that one of the closest properties to this shredder? The very last one? To the shredder?
No, the furthest
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Here's Powerhouse Road. Smell the
The very last house.
Here's the shredder. I would say probably not.
Been breathing diesel for years.
I know, look at him, healthy as a horse too.
Because as it is now, I have one day off during the week, and most of the time can't go outside because we have a beautiful patio. As far as enjoyment, can't enjoy it because we can't sit out there. And most of the times I have to keep the slider and the back windows closed because of the grease smell or whatever it is. Some days I'll get home just getting out of my car, which is in the front of the house, and it's like, oh, it's gonna be a bad day because you can smell it. The noise, you can be in the shower with the water running, and I would swear somebody's slamming my front doors. That's how loud it is. And, you know, not being able to just use your own backyard during the week.
And that's without the shredder running.
Yes, that's without it. And this was the first year, we've never had a patio because I'm definitely afraid of snakes. My husband built me a patio and I can't use it unless it's Saturday or Sunday. We've had people over and have asked, how can you live here with this noise?
My name's Ron, from the Adler at 9 West Road. This company that is putting the shredder, did you once have a Rochester, New Hampshire, about 8 years ago, get turned down on the same thing?
I don't, I've only worked for these people for 3 or 4 years, but
Because of the noise?
not.
Did you get the shredder from Rochester?
No, no one's put a shredder in, ever tried to put a shredder in Rochester.
Did you once have the company in Rochester?
Nope, it's the first company we've ever owned.
The question, did you hear the question, the board hear the question, the last question? You know, did you ever, he just said he'd never owned a company before this one.
Well, I also live in Berwick, and I'm concerned about the school being so close to this. My grandkids go down there. I moved up here 15 years ago, and I'm a quiet person. And I can actually hear that from my house. I'm a Vietnam vet, and I hear certain things that other people don't hear. And I think the quality of life in Berwick is good, and this may affect years down the road the kids. I'm guessing they're not lying. I'm concerned about my grandkids. That's what I'm concerned about.
I have just another question about this
Who are
one.
you?
Oh, sorry, I live on Pine Hill Road, Kristen Dahl. I'm just wondering, I've heard with wind projects sometimes that some of the residential complaints are less about the level of the noise and more about, kind of the pitch and the, kind of, you know, up and down. It's that quality of the noise that irritates people. And I'm wondering if the noise is looked at on that assessment at all, or if it's purely decibels and that doesn't factor in.
I think the Berwick ordinance is pretty clear, there's a AUA standard in there that everybody in town is supposed to meet. That's what is looked at.
So that's what,
Correct.
you can go.
That's what the standard says, I would
Is
agree
that something
with-
that you looked at when you were conducting the assessment?
Yes.
Yeah.
And your approval is contingent just on what the ordinance says and you don't take other factors into account?
We can only go with what the ordinance says. Yeah.
Christine Appleby, I live on Trivet 36, 10 Orchard Lane. I was reading one article about a company in California that was trying to build a shredder, and they had a lot of flack because of the bad ones that they've had. So this company was talking about how they were not gonna be like the bad ones were. They were gonna be located on a 15-acre industrial site, well away from any residential area or retail businesses. So my question would be then, why in Berwick are we gonna allow in a residential area next to a school, something that could be harmful, noisy, dirty? And, someone did say to me, because I didn't know if the shredder had been tested, and they said, oh no, it's run, because we heard it at the elementary school on the playground, and it's not. So just for that,
It hasn't been run except for that 1 hour that they did the
well,
meeting.
they must have heard it.
Or they heard another business that's down there running something. I mean, if they have not run, they'd be in violation
Well, I
of
think,
more than just us.
I'm insinuating that they probably heard it then,
Oh, they probably did.
yeah.
Ma'am, no, sorry.
She's
Saw
probably
the R in the
referring,
wrong place.
she's probably referring the week of the tweaking he was doing.
Okay. Sorry.
some mention of the scrubbers and the runoff water from this. Is there no concern about groundwater pollution? Is that kind of considered?
The process is taking place on impervious surface.
Sorry, I can't hear.
The process is taking place essentially on impervious surface, all right? And there isn't what we consider processed water. We're talking about spray mist that will be taken up by the material, so we don't anticipate any runoff from that. The fellow that's operating the shredder will actually control the nozzles to the spray mist. So the particulates they're talking about are controlled. There's enough water on those to dampen them, to hold them, okay? But not enough so that we have it running out of the bottom of the machine. You could see that the 1 hour that we ran the machine, all right? We had no water coming out of the bottom of the machine. We had the DEP there with us, went down and took a look at what was happening at the bottom of the machine because they had a concern of what was dropping out of the shredder. And we did not have water coming out of it. What happens is when they put the water into the shredder, they get steam. If you are there watching the process, it heats up. The spray nozzles are actually in the shredder. The person operating the shredder is watching to see when he's getting particulate matter, if he's having anything fly or anything like that, and he's actually manually controlling those nozzles.
So whatever slight runoff there is, does it go into a wetlands area? Does it
I
go
don't
into the
believe,
river?
our intention is there is no water from those spray labs. There is storm water that will come through the site. Can't keep storm water off the site, okay? That storm water does go through an extensive filtering process prior to running off the site.
Of which isn't there now, I mean, wasn't there. Stuffy.
I'm Donna Duffy of the infamous Duffy property. One of my concerns is fire. The site is very crowded, and I really don't believe a fire truck could get in and out of there more than one at a time, but more at night, because by the time anybody would see that, that place is gonna be going pretty good by the time the fire department gets there. And they showed us the tank and the fire hose system, but that's not gonna be any good if it's a fire at night, because nobody's gonna be there to operate it. And I just firmly believe that that area isn't the area for this kind of operation. It's too residential and it's so close to the school. Thank you.
What did Chief say when he went down to?
Pardon me?
What did the fire chief say when he went down to the site?
Fire chief was happy before we put the tank in and the fire hose. Okay, remember we put the water line down the road? Typically, Rob, jump in here if I'm incorrect, but you've had one fire?
That is correct, we had
Since
one
you've been
fire.
there. He's been operating this place now for 6 years. He's had one fire in that time, and that fire was the result of somebody welding on the site.
Somebody using a cutting torch. Yep.
And that was somebody there working that started that fire. But I didn't go into it, okay, but if you take a look at the site plans, there's a very limited amount of process that is going to be left on the site. The stuff that's the residue, we will only have no more than 2 truckloads. It needs to be 2 truckloads because we need to be able to load 1 truck, all right, and then load the next one. So we're going to have 2 loads of that. It's a very small area. It's contained in a concrete enclosure. And then the other section will be the metal particles that come out of the shredder. And that also is contained in a pile, and I don't believe that is very flammable, is it, Ron?
No, not at all. And the fire department also has the knock box with the keys in it, so they can get it any time of night as well.
Representative O'Connor.
Thank you. I actually had, I just wanted to say about the sound level there. The Duffy's property and the residential, that was pre-existing before they applied for this conditional use permit. I understand that the auto salvage yard was there, but the auto shredder brings that to a whole different level. So I'm really concerned about their constitutional rights that violate, their enjoyment, like it says in our particular, ordinance. ordinance here, but it also is a constitutional right. That being said, I also am very concerned when you talk about the auto shredder residue, there's about 350 to 500 pounds depending on the automobile. And I'm very concerned because a couple of letters were presented that we'd be able to get rid of that residue, and it's a lot more difficult. It used to be able to be treated with cement, and they put it over landfill, but we can't do that anymore because they showed the leakage on that. There's mercury, zinc, cadmium, different chemicals, and they said that there was a couple of companies that we could take this particular fluff or auto shredder residue, and I tried to find those companies, and I did find one, and it's fairly inactive. They haven't done much work, and then the other one that was used hasn't had a delivery since 2007. And the state, you're supposed to get a return receipt when that residue goes out. And these were both companies that delivered to China and other things, and I don't have any facts, but there's something that is called a 3-mile dump. And basically it's, you go out and you just dump what you have and then come back for another load. And I want to make sure that nothing like that happens. And I want to make sure that, I know we have to recycle, and I really want to make sure that if this does have to happen, we have best operating practices, that nobody's constitutional rights are violated, their enjoyment of their property, which was pre-existing. But I want to make sure there's a real place for this residue to go, because I did pretty good research, and one of them, Key Solution, 1 shipment since 2007. That's a problem. The other companies seemed kind of fly by night. When I tried to call those companies, I didn't even get, and nobody even answered the phones. So I'd really like to have some information secured on that.
Can you clarify what residue you're talking about?
Auto shredder residue, the fluff, and that will come out of that's the waste product. And although they can store it on site, you can only store so much of that. And there's a huge market for this right now for to shred automobiles and to get rid of them, because I don't know if you're aware of the Cash for Clunkers program that caused an increase in this. So the amount of auto shredder residue is going up. And there's innovation taking place now, and hopefully soon we'll be able to use that and make products with it and really recycle it. But in the meantime, it's very difficult to get rid of, and I'm very concerned about that, because if it does sit on the site and there's an abundance of it, the leakage will have cadmium, mercury, and other contaminants in it. So, like I said, I do believe fully in recycling, and I think that there's a lot of things that we can do to make sure, if something like this has to happen, that we make sure that all the best operating practices are in effect. I know sometimes that costs a lot of money to do, but there's a little over 200, maybe 250 auto shredder places in the country, and they generate over $500 million in revenue, and this one probably won't be an exception to that. So I think to make money, you need to invest money, and I just really hope that we can follow best business management practices.
Okay, so to answer your question about the companies, they do exist. I have filed many, many shipments with documentation, with overseas containers numbers, with pictures, with freight forwarders, with all that information. You're not gonna be able to find that, okay? Our industry is like the diamond industry. If you don't know who to talk to, you're not gonna find it. That's just the way it is. I shipped out some of that product. I have documentation, but I can go out to my pickup truck, get the documentation, and bring it right in here and show it to you. There is a company in the United States, has a $20 million system, produces 7,000 ton of this stuff a month that they go through. They buy it from everybody all over the United States. Like I said, I'm not necessarily interested in showing it to all the public. Nobody needs to know where I sell my stuff. But they are real companies, and I can get the documentation.
How do you store it?
How do I store what?
When you're shredding it, you all this stuff that you got to ship out. Where do you store it until you ship it?
ship daily.
Rob,
Oh, daily you ship out.
Rob, what we